Welcome to Hash It Out, a podcast built by data security experts. We decipher the data security landscape through honest conversations about today's headlines and tomorrow's challenges. Brought to you by Virtru. Let's dive in.
On this episode of Hash It Out, we ask, what happens when mission speed outruns legacy networks? Virtru's Tim Clayton, ex-AWS Mission Partner Environmental Lead, unpacks data-centric zero trust sharing from a globe-spanning strike group to INDOPACOM, and why 2027 urgency makes agility the mission. Let's hash it out.
All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Hash It Out. I'm Dana Morris. I lead product and engineering here at Virtru. Today, I'm joined by a very exciting guest, a first-time appearance on Hash It Out, my new colleague, Tim Clayton. Today, we're going to be exploring a topic that's pretty near and dear to our hearts, which is something called the mission partner environment and how Virtru is helping allied partners to collaborate more freely and to operate at a sort of modern mission speed. And I think with that intro, I'm going to kick it over and just say welcome to Tim. Thank you for joining us today. And maybe we'll kick it off with Tim, just a quick intro of who he is, where he comes from, and a little bit more about his background.
Sure. Appreciate being here. So my name's Tim Clayton. I was educated and trained as a software engineer, did so for a couple of decades as a contractor. My most recent job before this was at AWS, where I was a senior solutions architect on our Air Force team and led a lot of the MPE efforts that they had there.
So Tim, let's talk quickly before we dive into the subject, just, what's led you to join Virtru right now? What's exciting about joining, the company? Why did you want to come here? Why are you here at Virtru now?
I think it's an interesting kind of connection of events. So I was at AWS for about 5.5 years, and I kind of became the lead of our MPE efforts, as I mentioned. And on the DoD side, MPE as a mission moved from the area of Air Force Executive Agency to DISA. And when that happened, transitions in larger organizations are more difficult. And so I knew that I wanted to continue on that mission. MPE is a passion of mine. And I think it's probably the most important thing that the DoD kind of has on its plate right now. And every interaction that I had on any of our MPE efforts, it seemed that Virtru was involved in some way, shape, or form. The data-centric security of that piece of this tech stack seemed to always be at that intersection. So, Virtru came up again and again and again. I was involved in a workshop and in a project at AWS where we were actually using Virtru to build a demo piece for the AUKUS, which is a trilateral kind of data sharing agreement between the US, UK, and Australia. And Virtru was used there. And it was kind of an interesting, again, connection of events where Virtru came up again. I was also involved with Project Olympus and with connecting some of the data with HighMast. And again, Virtru was there again. And so we kind of became a fan of what Virtru had to offer and the services that it specifically provided. What you'll find is that in the DoD world, almost everything still uses network-based security. Everything's network isolation, everything's air-gapped, either through direct physical air-gapped or through some sort of encryption. And ABAC really is kind of a tack on. The idea of zero trust is kind of, hey, let's do this in addition to what we're already doing. And I think Virtru is kind of a standout differentiator there when it comes to saying, hey, zero trust is the core of what you do. Data-centric security is the core of what you do. And so I think the stars aligned. I saw I needed to make a shift. And then with, we're going to talk about a little bit about what happened in Brussels. Again, Virtru came on my radar again. And I think it just signs pointed that direction. And when the opportunity came, I find myself here trying to continue that MPE mission that I think is so vital to the DoD efforts.
Yeah, Tim, it's funny, sometimes the stars align. I think they do feel like they're aligning pretty well, given your passion for MPE and kind of where we're focused as a company. You said a bunch of interesting things there. I think you mentioned things like data centricity, you mentioned ABAC or attribute-based access control. You mentioned the MPE or mission partner environment several times, and then something called HIMASS. Why don't we take these in sort of a quick order? Maybe you could touch on quickly, like, what is the mission partner environment? Like, what is the core problem it's trying to solve, and why that's so critical? And then we can kind of bridge to how that relates to HIMASS, which has been in the news a little bit lately, and then take it from there into some of the topics like ABAC and data centricity.
Sure, there's a lot to cover. So mission partner environment is a very specific kind of concept. Originally, the idea of sharing data obviously has been around for a while. About a decade ago, I think it was in 2014, the DoD CIO came up with the idea of the mission partner environment as a contract, as a support element to some of the missions that were going on in the DoD. And what they wanted to do was establish a standard way for one entity to share their data with another entity. And those entities could be across the same mission. Originally, it was obviously within the DoD. It was within, it was kind of spurred off the idea of 9/11, when you have all these elements, you had to share data. But then we had another requirement to share with our allies. And all allies use different identity providers. Some of those providers are third party, but most of them are terrestrial, which means that, DoD is going to provide their own identity, and they don't want to really own the other identities. So they tried to come up with a paradigm where they could share that data. So MPE was kind of divided into different efforts, things like APAN, Sabre, Project Olympus. These are one-off, originally kind of experiments that became military exercises that I think just recently have changed into the idea of mission support. And that's something we can talk about in a minute, about what was announced in Brussels. So traditionally, it's this idea of being able to share data effectively with people that you need to participate with, or allies that you need to participate with.
Makes sense. That's a really good explanation, I think. Maybe before we talk about Brussels, let's talk a little bit about HIMASS, Operation HIMASS. And then give me a second. I'll give a little background, that I want to kind of pull on one particular aspect of that that's particularly challenging. It kind of speaks to the broader challenge, and then get your thoughts on that. So, Operation HIMASS, we've been involved with the UK and the US Department of Defense for a number of years now. And HIMASS is kind of the culmination of multiple years of efforts, as you're well aware, where it's a UK carrier strike group that is going basically around the world, has a couple of other support vessels that are from other nations participating. And as it's going around the world, it's crossing multiple areas of responsibility, right? Or AOR, that's crossing multiple combatant commands or COCOMs. So if you think about leaving the UK and you go all the way around the world, just leaving there and going through the Mediterranean, you're crossing through European Command and Central Command, and maybe through African Command and or Pacific Command, which we'll talk about later. So, one of the things that I think is interesting about that is you mentioned the mission partner environment and that concept of sharing data. Can you maybe give a little bit of color on, like, what is so challenging when you cross all those COCOMs, and what's actually happening when somebody that carrier strike group is going through those areas? It's trying to collaborate. Like, how does that happen today, and like, how is it maybe changing?
Yeah. So in the DoD, policy for a long time has been very network-centric. So if you think about networks like NIPR, SIPR, JWICS, these are classification-based. So there's this idea of you need a network that can contain and protect a very specific classification of data. And so all the networks that connect to that are essentially colors of those classification bands. So they're not ABAC centric, right? They're not data centric. It's all, layers of networks and encryption across those. And anytime you need to cross data between them, you have to use some sort of CDS, data to basically push data across a diode of some sort. And so historically, this is difficult because all these networks exist. They want to get rid of them, but the way policy proceeds so slowly in the DoD that it's difficult to get rid of them without a huge shift in how you're going to protect the data.
Yep.
So if you're going to move across all these different areas, they're going to have different networks. They're going to be different people operating those networks. And so moving data across those things becomes extremely difficult to meet policy, because although they may be at the same classification, they may even be operating with the same people, because they're moving across a different network. You start moving through a whole different policy. So data-centric security is kind of a key to that. It's going to unlock the ability to have data that exists in two systems that can have the data interact and have those users interact with the data, but the users don't actually have to transit those network systems. And that breaks that paradigm just enough that it's going to enable a lot more. So that's really the key there, is that shifting into zero trust and data-centric security is kind of a core element of that zero trust. It really enables you to not worry about what network you're on, what identity you're providing, what classification you have. Wherever the data is and it's tagged with that specific type of data attribute, then you're going to be able to access it no matter where you are or where you need to be.
Right. I think we'll get to Brussels here in a second. I think it's a nice buildup. If you think about like Operation HIMARS, they're using data-centric concepts. So to your point, they're moving the classification from the network to the object. And then that object could be a PDF file, it could be a Word file, it could be a geospatial image, it could be a video, it could be
a chat message,
any of those things. And they're moving it down to that message, that object, that file, and then having the data be self-describing in a way, and using cryptography or encryption to bind them together, so that becomes the unlock for that data to move, right? And so, we went to Brussels, you and I were both there. You were there at the time with AWS, and I was there with Virtru at the Mission Partner Environment Summit that was hosted by the U.S. Department of Defense, but involved a whole host of other nations and partners. And HIMARS was a big focus, right? We had the UK there talking about what they were doing with HIMARS and the success they were seeing, where they were hearing their commanders talk about the agility that the data-centric part of the exercise was unlocking for them. And one of their biggest frustrations was just that they had to use their legacy network-centric for some aspects of their mission and the data-centric aspect for other parts. And they were asking, why can't we just do it all with data centricity, which was obviously music to our ears, but clearly there's a lot of work to get there. Maybe I do want to hear from you in a second on what you took away from that summit, because I'm sure, just given your background, you maybe heard different things or took away different insights than I did. I mean, for me, it was kind of my first experience of being in a room with senior leaders across areas of the U.S. military and, allied military partners, and hearing the things that really stood out to me were, one, that everybody was talking about the same standard. There's a document called Allied Communication Publication 240, or ACP 240. That's a Five Eyes document, Five Eyes being US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, right? That document describes data-centric interoperability as a concept, and it documents how the trusted data format that Virtru is known for is a key part of that. That's how you get the attributes attached to the data. And everybody was talking about that. Was news to me, and it was really interesting to see how broadly and quickly that's been adopted in the last 2 years, really. The other thing that stood out was just the sense of urgency around 2027, and, definitely a sense of urgency across the whole community in terms of unlocking this modern mission partner agility, right? Agility is really the focus. Security has to be there, but agility, we need to move faster. We need to be able to share data with new allies new partners dynamically. We can't afford to take 6 months to spin up a network. Like that really stood out to me. I'm curious, like, what did you hear? Obviously, I'm sure you heard some of that, but what else did you take away that was unique and interesting from that summit?
Yeah. So policy is always the gatekeeper to some of these technologies, and different agencies like DISA, right? They pay a lot of lip service to those policies. They're, obviously they have to be risk averse in many cases. And while they're always saying, hey, we're willing to change policy, it seems to be much just lip service, right? They don't really move that quickly unless there's a need. And so what happens is when you have something like HIMARS that is obviously very enabling, very powerful, very high level visibility throughout the government, suddenly there becomes pressure from the top. So what I heard there was, I think, just a few things. Number one, you heard General Stanton say that they were going to move executive agency from the Air Force to DISA. And the reason they're doing that is for this big announcement was they're changing their perspective of MPE from this idea of, an experiment to the idea that they're focusing on mission support. And those two words, mission support, means they're actually supporting missions that are happening in theater instead of just talking about technology and data sharing as it's a back end kind of, check the box. So that means that they have a mission need that's going to have visibility. And then they said on stage that they obviously are going to have to change policy to make some of this stuff happen. That's more than just saying in passing. It's kind of making an announcement that they recognize that policy is a gatekeeper here. And there's really kind of a few policies there. One is on cross-domain, which has to come from the NCDSMO or the cross-domain authority. And another one is about data centricity, and that's really about DISA. And the third one, because I came from a CDS, from a cloud provider, is really this idea of SCCA compliance and SRG compliance, but that's a whole other topic. And all these three things are kind of changing at the same time. And that's really this kind of inflection point. You mentioned these dates, right? These dates, 2027, 2030, these are essentially modeling inflection points that the intelligence community sees, that they have to have certain missions have to be in motion at those times, or we're already on the back foot. And so those things have to happen. They see that the pressure's on, and so things are going to change pretty quickly. And that's what that announcement was about, hey, saying, not only are we saying it has to change, we're giving you a deadline, right? That by when those things have to change instead of just paying lip service.
Yeah, that's a really good insight, Tim. Like, certainly if you're not in that community, it would be hard to pull apart like the differences in the policy implications of what was being said.
Yeah.
I think the data-centric concepts, what's really interesting to me is like the product and engineering guy. It's just, as I hinted at this in my first comments, but that change in posture around, it used to be security and then agility. And I've seen in the last few years, those words switched around.
Yep.
It's agility and security. That may seem subtle, but it's a pretty important shift. I think to your point about the need, what's driving it is really that need to be able to operate much, much more agile than they could previously, because the reality of modern missions, which don't always mean warfighting missions, just missions, right? In general, it could even be peacekeeping missions.
Yeah.
You're often now interacting with partners that are not part of a coalition. They're not part of NATO. They're not part of Five Eyes or AUKUS. And the traditional approach would have been, let's spin up a network and let's put in some CDS devices. And by the time you went through all the approvals and did all that, it could be 6 and 8 and 12 months later, the mission already happened, right? Like, it's already done. And what you need is the ability to do that in minutes, not months. And that's where this idea of data centricity is quite powerful, because if I tag the data the right way, the data can move, the policy attached to the data, but equally I can then entitle new partners to the same like mission or classification, and they would be able to see that data for only the time period they need to, and I can take it away later. So I have this really good agility to add quickly and remove quickly and kind of operate at the speed of mission. Like, is that how you're seeing it as well?
Yeah. So, when you're looking at a small network, let's just say like AUKUS or Five Eyes, obviously those, you have the same participants, right? In AUKUS, you have 3 participants. That's not going to change. Five Eyes, you have 5. It's not going to change. But when you look at even something like NATO, right? The number of members in NATO is going to vary over time. And then if you're talking about a coalition that doesn't have that type of overlying classification, right? Those are going to vary. Our participation in INDOPACOM, the one we'll probably talk about in a minute, that's going to vary greatly. And those countries aren't part of those coalitions. So you have to have a system, a data-centric system that doesn't strictly rely on classification tags. It has to rely on who's participating in the network at a specific time, and that means who's accessing the data at that time. And so it has to be data-centric. It cannot be network-centric. And that's really, again, another kind of shift that we're seeing here with ACP 240. When NATO came out and said, hey, this is what we're going to use as our standing, it's a huge, huge green flag that something's going right in that kind of arena. And that, whenever Virtru and the idea of this data-centric security is kind of granted, kind of the TDF is put into that as code, as policy, suddenly you've got a huge leg up on what's going to make up that network and how you're going to participate in that network. So another big boon, I think, to Virtru in that aspect.
Yeah, and maybe before we touch on INDOPACOM, because I kind of want to wrap up there, I think it's a pretty important topic to cover off and sort of at the end, particularly with us having a presence here soon at a conference where we'll be more focused on Indo-Pacific. Maybe let's quickly talk about how does the same principles or concepts maybe apply outside of the defense industry and the defense military kind of complex. Like, when I think of things like know your customer, a good example might be, banks. Banks have to collaborate often and are equally, they don't have a trilateral usually, right? They don't have like maybe an agreement other than a piece of paper. And often it's similar in that sense that you have a semi-trusted partner, right? Like they're still a partner. They're not inside your organization. And so this ability to be able to share data where you keep control and you see what they're doing with the data, that sort of visibility and control gives you that agility, but also gives you like confidence that you can share that data and not lose control of it. That's also a big part of this sort of what we see with the mission partner environment, right? And do you see other use cases maybe in the commercial sense where that same kind of problem would come up?
Yeah, I see it in 2 ways. So first of all, despite claims to the otherwise, most cloud providers don't really have an ABAC solution. If they do, it's an attachment or a third-party tool built on top of something that they're tagging all their systems with. It's truly not ABAC. It may be role-based, it may even be network-based, but it basically uses tags to do those things. So if you see kind of a unified paradigm that's being used by the DoD or by an external agency, that's obviously going to signal to the community at large, commercial community, that this is something they can use as well. Everyone's going to use the cloud eventually. They have to because of a scalability. And so having a tool that already has a proven kind of pathway to guaranteeing ABAC is powerful. Second, a lot of these cloud providers, when you talk about the DoD can't run in a secure, bubble inside of either a secret or a top secret or even a classified region forever. They're going to have to be able to put their data in other commercial regions. So this is going to become a commercial standard, I think, at some point in the near future, where there's going to be a data-centric ABAC security paradigm that you're going to be able to follow to meet those requirements, whether you're talking about classification requirements, whether you're talking about HIPAA, whether you're talking about, financing requirements, whether you're talking about data separation, some sort of clean rooms kind of concept where you can have different participants access the data they need, whether they have that network access or not. So I think there's going to be a kind of a shift to that as data-centric security becomes more and more prevalent, whether it's Virtru or not.
Spot on, Tim. I think I often tell people, my observation after doing technology, mostly enterprise before Virtru, but I did have some experience with defense and intelligence in my past life at IBM. And what I usually observed was there's a lot of these cases where maybe the government or the Defense Department is a laggard on specific, not technology trends, but on actual implementations. Meaning, like, for example, they might be running an operating system that's old because they have to roll it out to 1 million people. But usually what I've also observed on the other side of the coin is defense is often ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to broad changes, technology changes. You think back, like DARPANet was the first internet, or you think about GPS, right? General global positioning satellites was a defense-focused, intelligence-focused thing to start, and it moved into the commercial space, and now none of us can live without it.
Yeah.
And mobile devices, even, there was a lot of mobility way back in the early days with the military and tough books and things, and it became a trend to start moving things into smaller and smaller devices. So I'm kind of the opinion, and you're kind of sharing, and I think, which is data centricity is an unlock for a lot of workflows. And if you can start moving more of that classification and control to the object itself, you can actually share more data, get more value out of your data.
I mean, the DoD has hundreds, if not thousands, of different networks that cost a lot of money to maintain. And they want to flatten those networks, and they don't have any way to do it. So I think if you can find, a type of tech stack that can present a solution to that, to flatten those networks, then that's going to become a standard no matter what, as you said, because as long as you can maintain the encryption standards and you can maintain the isolation standards, which these days tech is not the problem. It's all policy.
Yeah.
And we see that policy slowly changing. And I think by 2027, a lot of that policy is going to be shifted over to this new idea of, if we can establish, a good zero trust standard, and data center security is kind of a key piece of that. If we can establish zero trust, then we open a lot of doors and we unlock a lot of capability, and we reduce cost of maintaining all those systems pretty drastically. So scalability and as you said, being able to move around the world and control your data sovereignty ultimately becomes so important. So I think there's a lot of capability there that I think Virtru can unlock and maybe be a thought leader in that space in the coming years.
Yeah, Tim, sort of kind of coming full circle here. You mentioned 2027, and we mentioned the MPE Summit earlier in Brussels. And one of the other takeaways I had was just how much focus there was on INDOPACOM, or Indo-Pacific Command.
Yeah.
A couple of things that stood out to me. One, I guess once it was pointed out, it became obvious to me, but I did not understand that INDOPACOM covers 50% of the world in terms of geography. That's a huge area of responsibility. And so what a big job it is to be the commander of INDOPACOM. I'm local Paro. I don't envy in that role. But can you maybe explain a little bit about why how is INDOPACOM so central in the DoD, and what, at a high level, like what is so important about what's kind of driving that 2027 focus?
Yeah. Essentially, the number one competitor with the U.S. Now and probably in the near future is going to be China. Mm-hmm. In that arena, we have a lot of allies, and I think we want to keep that data flowing as best we can. And
Sure.
So the mission here is, how do we provide information that we can share with those allies that are in the INDOPACOM, and they can share data with us in a way that keeps us on the forefront of information. And also finances, right? Financing in those areas is going to become ultimately important. While the possibility of, some sort of altercation is high, it's probably not as high as a financial one, right? There's always going to be an economic issue before that. And so I think the establishment of how are we going to properly share information, intelligence information, and financial information, and protect it all in that area before those deadlines hit, it is really, really important. It becomes pretty much the primary mission that not just the DoD has, but really the entire world kind of has to try and build that protective shell before anything else happens. And so that's why it's really important, and not just to us. It becomes important to pretty much the entire West. Obviously, DoD has a focus on that right now. Everything they're doing is about how do we create movements in the area? How do we share data in the area? And as I mentioned before, a lot of those allies are not part of our traditional data sharing kind of partners. So I think that's why it's important. We have a very serious deadline. We know it's important, not just for protecting ourselves, but for protecting our data and finances.
Yeah, I think we'll probably just close it up around that sort of general idea there, Tim. I think it's been a really good conversation. I mean, what I take away is like INDOPACOM is super unique in that it doesn't have an existing NATO or something else. I mean, obviously there's Australia and New Zealand, but outside of that, there's a whole host of other nations.
Absolutely.
Our partners, I mean, they're allies, but they're not part of an existing coalition. So in the Indo-Pacific theater becomes like this really interesting petri dish, for lack of a better term, like where you really have like the most interesting use case of sharing data across allies that maybe you haven't traditionally shared data as freely with, and data centricity becomes a super unlock for that. It becomes like a real driver for it. So I think we'll close it there. I think really enjoyed the conversation. We're actually going to be out in Hawaii, in 2 weeks, the end of October at the TechNet Indo-Pacific event, booth number 932. So I would encourage people, if you're going to be there, to stop by and see us. We're obviously going to be interfacing with the Indo-Pacific command team and other industry partners there. And so I think it'll be a lively event and one where we can kind of take this conversation further. But with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for joining us today, Tim.
Awesome. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to having some fun here.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and tune in next time for another episode of Hash It Out.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review, and don't miss us the next time we hash it out. Like, follow, and subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, all linked below.